it's Angela with the Mount Airy Public Library. We are here with storyteller Brack Llewellyn tonight, and he is going to share with us his very own story that he created years ago, and I can't wait for you to hear it. I love it. This is one of my favorites. So sit back and enjoy. This is the story about the deepest hole in the world. All right, let's go.
All right. Everybody gather around. Come on in close. Bring the adults in. They need to hear this too, so let the grown-ups come and hear this story as well. Because this is one of my favorites. I haven't told this story in a long time, and I'm grateful for the chance to tell it once again. This is, as Angela said, the story of the deepest hole in the world. It involves a young man whose name was Marvin. Marvin never got around much, never traveled much, but he always wanted to see the whole world. But Marvin didn't really have, well, what he needed to travel. He didn't have a lot of money. He didn't have a car to drive. He didn't have a train ticket. He didn't have a ticket for an airplane. But he really wanted to see the world. So one day Marvin decided he'd set out on his own to see as much of the world as he could. So he packed up everything he thought he would need. He packed some extra pairs of socks and some clothes. He packed 5 peanut butter sandwiches, made those himself, figured maybe 5 is all he'd need to see all the way around the world. And he opened up his bank and he got out all the money he had in the whole world, which is almost $6. And he put it in his little change purse and put that in his pocket. He put his sandwiches and his clothes and a few other things in his knapsack, and he threw it over his shoulder, and off he went. Well, Marvin walked for a good long time. And he walked out of the town where he lived and across a few fields and down some roads and came onto a road he didn't know very well. And he came to a big field. In the middle of this field, he saw an old man sitting in a chair with a big umbrella over it to keep the sun off him. And next to the man, there was a cardboard box, a good-sized cardboard box. And as Marvin got closer, he could see that on this cardboard box it read, "Beneath this box lies the deepest hole in the world." Well, Marvin was very curious about this. So he reached over and he tapped the old fellow on the shoulder and woke him up and said, "Sir, I couldn't help but notice your sign there on the cardboard box. So this is the deepest hole in the world." The old fellow smiled and said, "Yeah, it is indeed. Dug it myself. Matter of fact, this hole is so deep it goes all the way through the whole world to the other side. If you crawl down in this hole and all the way to the other end, you will come out in this whole other country that I'll bet you've never seen before, young fellow. Oh, it's beautiful over there." And the old fellow stood there and he spun this story about a beautiful country with great fields of grain and towering mountains covered in snow and huge palaces. And the people were so nice and friendly, and the food was just delicious and so exotic. Well, Marvin stood there listening to all this, and his eyes got wider and wider. He thought, "Oh my, this is my chance. This is my chance to see the other side of the world, and I don't have to travel around the world. I just have to crawl through this hole." So he asked the old fellow, he said, "Well, could someone maybe crawl in through the hole and to the other side?" And the old man said, "Well, yeah, you could, but it'd be nice if maybe you could give me a little something for the privilege. I spent a lot of time digging this hole, you understand. It's a lot of work." And Marvin said, "Well, how much does it cost?" And the old man said, "Well, how much do you have?" Marvin said, "Well, all the money I have in the world, and it's almost $6. The old man clapped his hands. He said, "As luck would have it, that's exactly the price. Almost $6. So Marvin reached in his pocket and he got out his change purse and he took out all his money and he handed it to the old fellow. And then the old fellow said, Now put a rope down in the hole." He said, "Here's what you do. You climb down the rope. When you get to the end of the rope, you'll be halfway through the world. And then you'll climb uphill to the other side. And you'll come out in this whole other land." Marvin was so excited he couldn't even contain himself. He hitched up his knapsack and he started crawling down the rope. And he crawled down and down and down and down. It seemed like he crawled for hours. It was really only just a few minutes. And he kept down and down, kept thinking about all he was going to see on the other side of the world. And Marvin looked up, and as he did and got farther away from the surface, the opening of the hole got smaller and smaller and smaller, like it does when you move away from something. And as he climbed down and down and down, all of a sudden, his foot hit something. And then his other foot hit something. And Marvin looked down, and instead of the other side of the world, Marvin had hit the bottom of the hole. It did not go to the other side of the world. It just went down pretty deep and stopped. Well, Marvin was upset. He was angry. He shouted up to the top of the hole to the old man. He said, "Hey, this hole doesn't go through the world. It stops. You weren't honest with me. Hey!" But he got no reply. Well, Marvin was exhausted from climbing down the rope, and he was angry, and so he just sat down on the muddy floor of that hole, and he reached into his knapsack, and he dug out one of his peanut butter sandwiches, and he sat there eating it, just getting angrier by the moment. When he finished his sandwich, he stood up, and he took a deep breath. And he started climbing up that rope again. And when he got back to the surface, he was going to give that old man a piece of his mind. It took him forever to climb back up to the top, and by the time he got there, the old man, the chair, the umbrella were all gone. The cardboard box was still there, turned up on its side. The old man was nowhere to be seen, and there was poor Marvin. He hadn't seen the other side of the world. He'd been tricked, he'd been hoodooed, and he was out almost $6. Well, Marvin never did quite calm down from this. He didn't like somebody being so dishonest with him. But a few days later, as luck in this story would have it, Marvin saw the old man again. He saw him in a nearby town spending some of that $6. And Marvin had been thinking about this whole thing ever since it happened. So he walked up behind the old man. He tapped him on the shoulder. The old fellow turned around, and he was horrified to see Marvin standing there because he knew what he'd done. But Marvin, instead of being angry, broke into a big old grin and said, "Sir, I just want to thank you." He reached out and took the man's hand and shook his hand. He said, "I just want to thank you so much." He said, I know that hole of yours didn't go all the way through, but you know something? You were pretty close. He said, "I sat down there for a while and I thought, I wonder how much farther it is to the other side of the world. I started to dig with my bare hands, and do you know something? In about 15 minutes, I had dug straight through the other side of the world. You were that close. And let me just tell you, sir, the way you described this other land on the other side of the world, it isn't even close to what it's really like. It's beautiful. Just what a beautiful country, so different from ours. And the mountains were there, capped in snow, and great palaces and wide streets, and the people were so nice. And they fed me wonderful food and told me stories about their land and just welcomed me like I was one of their own. It was a great experience." The old fellow stood there listening to Marvin, and his eyes were getting wider and wider. Then Marvin said, "You know what? You ought to crawl through and see that land for yourself. You really should." And the old fellow said, "Well, maybe I should." So the two of them went back from the town, out the same path Marvin had taken, out to where the hole was. It was still there. And the old fellow started to climb down, and Marvin said, Now wait just a second. Maybe you should give me a little something for finishing the hole for you. Wouldn't that be fair?" The old fellow said, I suppose so. How much do you want?" Marvin said, "Well, it was almost $6 for me. How about almost $6 for you?" So the old man counted back the money that he had taken from Marvin, and down the rope he went. And Marvin stood at the top of the hole waiting. And sure enough, just a few minutes later, he heard a voice from way down in the hole and said, "Hey! Hey!" The old man was crying out. You didn't dig any on this hole. It's no deeper than when I dug it." And then Marvin reached down, he took the rope, and he pulled it up out of the hole as fast as he could, so the old man couldn't climb it back out. And Marvin called down the hole and said, "I'm going to leave you down there to think about this for a while." The old fellow shouted back up, "You weren't honest with me." And Marvin said, "Well, you weren't honest with me. How does it feel?" And Marvin stood there for a while, and then he sat down on the ground, and he waited, and he let the old fellow think about it for a good long time. He could hear the old man down there grumbling and grousing and shouting up occasionally. Finally, being the bigger person, Marvin lowered the rope into the hole so the old man could climb out. Marvin went on his way. As far as he knows, the old man made it out. Well, it turns out at that time, Marvin didn't see much of the world. But as he got older, he got a chance to travel. He saw a good bit of the world, including the other side of the world, but he didn't crawl through a hole to get there. He traveled the way most of us travel. And he enjoyed his travels. It made him a better person. But every time he took off on a trip, he thought about his encounter with this old man. And he wondered if maybe somewhere the old fella wasn't sitting next to another hole somewhere with a cardboard box over it and his chair. He hoped not. He hoped he learned his lesson. But he always thought about him whenever he traveled. Now, what did I learn from this story? Well, I learned this. If somebody tells you something and it sounds too good to be true, you know something? It probably is too good to be true. And being dishonest with people and taking their money dishonestly is never, ever a good idea, ever. And that's what I learned. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. You have always been a great audience, and we will see you again very soon.